Stuart Skelton, welcome to Sönghátíð í Hafnarborg. It is a great honor for us to have you here at this
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And of course, I have to use the opportunity, having such a great singer as yourself. And I'm very curious, I have to use the opportunity to ask you a few questions that might shed some light on your voice.
By all means.
On your artistry, on your roots also.
Yes, of course.
So I wanted to start first, perhaps, I'm asking you, how did you start to sing, or have you always sung? How did this begin?
I have always sung, interestingly. Of course, like most musicians, for the longest time, you're a musician or a singer or an instrumentalist or whatever it is as a child because you enjoy it. It's not something you ever think about, I'm going to do this for a living one day. But I was also doubly lucky in that I was educated at a choir school in Australia that's almost identical to that English cathedral school tradition. From the age of 7 until I graduated high school and went to university, and then even after, while I was at university, still was one of the lower voices in the choir. So I was, probably almost 20 years in a cathedral choir,
wow.
Maybe 15 or 16 years in a cathedral choir. And at 7 and 8 and 9, when these new concepts of being able to read music and those sorts of things are introduced, you don't think of them as complicated or difficult, you just think of it as something that you didn't know one day, and then at some point you do know, and you don't know when that switch flips.
So do you think that learning how to read music was pretty effortless for you?
Well, it was at the time. I mean,
yeah.
I know now that when I'm learning new repertoire, it takes me so much longer than it used to, and I find it frustrating. Mind you, I can't see as well as I used to, so I have to wear glasses now, which is frustrating. Well, actually, no, my eyesight's fine. My arms are too short.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
But it just, when you're as a child, the way that you learn all sorts of things, you just learn it because you're in that age of development where everything that comes at you is new information, and you just assimilate it. It's like a sponge,
Yeah.
It's like small children. It blows my mind. I have a 5-year-old niece, Mirun, here, who speaks Icelandic 8,000 times better than I do, because that's all she's ever done, and now already is speaking English to me at 5 and 6. And I think I was not able to speak anything but English at 6, and mine was Australian English, so it probably didn't even count. So it's just that there's an age at which children just absorb all the information and don't realise that what they're absorbing is knowledge. It's just something that they didn't know, and then they do know it.
So I find it very interesting that you should have sung in a choir for such a long time, because one of the things one cannot help but notice when one listens to you sing is that you have a very, very big voice. I listened to you at the Teatro Real singing Siegmund,
Valkyria,
Wagner, and I was very impressed by your artistry and by the beauty and the sheer size of your voice.
You're making me blush.
But tell me, have you always had such a big voice, and how was it to sing in a choir?
It's interesting. I don't know. Certainly as a boy soprano before my voice broke, as a treble, I don't think there was any awareness certainly not on my part, of my voice being any bigger than anyone else's in the choir at the time. And of course, when you're brought up in that musical tradition, and you grow up with these other 7 and 8-year-old boys, and as our voices broke, they broke at about the same time. So we're moving into the altos and the tenors and the basses at about the same time. You just knew that what was required from you was that there was a real homologation of sound, a unity of sound, and so that's what you did.
You mix.
And I wasn't aware of it being problematic or difficult to do at the time. To be fair, I did sing in the basses for quite some time.
Okay.
So that was something that probably got me out of all the trouble.
Yeah, you just said before that at university you sang with the lower voices.
I did, yeah, absolutely.
So when did you realize that you were a tenor?
Well, it was after my voice broke, and the choir master at St Andrew's Cathedral had suggested I get my voice trained. And I was singing in the basses at that stage, probably because I think as your voice breaks, there's that mid-range for most male voices that hasn't specified itself yet. And that's kind of where I was.
At what age was that?
16, I think. I went a little bit late, 16, almost 17. So I sort of graduated naturally into the basses. And I think probably a wise move on the choir master's part. Had I moved into the tenors straight away, I think me getting the tenor lines, or those notes of the tenor, would have been all or nothing to a certain extent. And I think that would have probably to the detriment of the blend of the sound. Yeah. So having a freshly broken voice that just sort of slotted into that little sort of mid-baritone range. But he suggested I get my voice trained with a voice teacher, and I had given no thought to that at all, of course. And I went on his recommendation to my very first singing teacher in Australia, Ray McDonald, who heard me sing and went, "You're definitely a tenor, probably dramatic, but we won't know for a little while, so let's just work on what we do have, and as it reveals itself, we'll deal with that as it comes."
So he heard the material, but decided to go slowly, perhaps.
And when I went to university in the United States, having done all the economics and law stuff in Australia.
So you first studied?
Yeah, I graduated high school and went to the University of Sydney and didn't do anything with music at all.
Oh, really?
No. I don't think there was anyone in our family that was ever thinking about being a musician for a living.
So you don't come from a family of musicians?
Nope, not a one.
That's interesting.
And then, of course, after graduating and working in the banking industry for a little while in Australia, I go off to the United States to audition for American universities, and my singing teacher in Cincinnati, Tom Baresai, wonderful guy and an amazing teacher. Everything I do well he's responsible for, and everything I do poorly is my fault. And I maintain that to this day.
Could you repeat his name?
Tom Baresai.
Right, we'll put him in that.
And Tom, and we're still in contact. If I've got a little issue with something, I can write to him and say, "Listen, this phrase, this thing, did it," and he'll come back to me in a couple of days and say, "Try this," and he's got an incredible, not only an ear, because he doesn't always hear what I'm doing, he can diagnose it without having hearing, which is really impressive.
Wow.
But when I came to Tom to sing for him for the first time, he said, "So, the tenor decision, who made the tenor decision?" I said, "My singing teacher in Australia." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, if you'd gone to 100 people, 50 of them would have said baritone, 50 of them would have said tenor." And I said, what camp are you in? He said, "I'm in the tenor camp."
Okay.
So, and the rest is history, to a certain extent.
No, because your voice is also, it's a very substantial voice. It's a heavy tenor voice.
And it's getting heavier over time. I mean, even 10 years ago. It's interesting. I've been thinking about this just recently because it's something that I'm more physically aware of now, is that everything for me was pre-Tristan and post-Tristan.
Oh, okay. Could you explain?
Well, I always had the feeling that before Tristan, my voice it had a certain colour to it, but it was still quite lyric and youthful in its way. And then I succumbed to the inevitable in 2016 and did Tristan for the first time. And everything since Tristan, it's been a little bit different. And I knew it would be. I knew going into Tristan that post-Tristan, you would need to make some accommodation for what Tristan was going to do.
Yes. Could you explain a bit to people who have not seen the opera or know even Wagner's music, what it means actually to sing this role and what kind of a role Tristan is?
It's interesting because the taxing part of Tristan, at least for Tristan, the taxing part for Isolde is a separate issue. But for Tristan, the part that all Tristans know that they're aware that it's coming is that the first 75% of Act 3, where you really just don't shut up. You just sing and sing. And the really challenging, not difficult, but challenging part of it is that whole part of Act 3 that Tristan is on stage and never leaves the stage and never stops singing, is that physically he's dying. So physically, your body has to be weaker and weaker and weaker as you go, but his spirit is being elevated at exactly the same time. The weaker his body gets, the more uplifted his spirit becomes. So you've got this very strange dichotomy of vocally, you have to be able to sound tired vocally, you have to make it sound tired when he's physically obviously struggling. But then towards the end of that whole section, towards the end of Act 3, at least for Tristan, he dies a bit early, is that you have to have the psychic nature of him being uplifted. You have to hear that vocally. You have to hear the voice and the body become separate. You have to watch the body decay and yet have the voice be more uplifted and more exalted than ever. So it's an interesting thing to work in two directions at the same time.
Wow.
And it's a challenge. It's a vocal challenge. There's a lot of singing. And the more physically broken he becomes, the more spiritually uplifted he becomes, the crazier he gets. And so the vocal requirements become more physically demanding.
Is it the most difficult role?
It certainly is for me, yeah. I suspect that people who sing Siegfried would say that Siegfried is, and they're probably right. But I don't sing Fried and I won't sing Siegfried, so for me, Tristan was my Everest. For some, Siegfried will be their Everest.
And I guess you have to have built yourself up for a very long time to
I'd been saying no to Tristan for a very long time prior to that. And we'd always said, my agent and I had always talked about this from a long time ago. At some point, you and I need to sit down and write down the conditions that need to be met before you say yes to your first Tristan, because we need to have discussed what they are, so we can say, right, have we checked all the boxes? And finally, we checked all the boxes. I was no longer in my early 40s. It was a long rehearsal period. It was a new production. It was a conductor that not only do I love working with, but is one of the genuine greats.
Who was that?
Simon Rattle.
Yes.
Simon and I have had a wonderful relationship over some time, with both the Berlin Philharmonic and the London Symphony Orchestra, and that the rest of the cast were people that I really, really, really wanted to be on stage with. And as it turns out, it was Stefan Milling and Evan Maria Vesbroek and the Berlin Philharmonic, and a 7-week rehearsal period in Baden-Baden, and Sir Simon Rattle conducting. And we just literally ran out of things to say no to. So and my agent said, according to the list, this is the one we're supposed to say yes to. So I did.
Yes, yeah. And so, in terms of preparing yourself for this role, which I guess you could say that you've been preparing yourself since you were 7.
Yeah, as it turns out. I didn't know that at the time, but yeah.
And coming back to your voice, and I would like to ask you about vocal technique, because you obviously have really great vocal technique, and that I'm sure that a lot of people would want to learn from you. And of course, it's all a very long process, and many things come into place. But
there are
a
couple of really like first principles about singing, and it's true, I think, for everyone, not just for dramatic repertoire. Is the one thing that I think is super important, from a purely technical point of view, is that this little piece of vocal fold that creates the sound for us is actually, it's the vibrating thing that makes the sound happen. Like a string on a violin would vibrate. If it's not vibrating, we don't hear it. Or the reeds on a clarinet, if they're not a clarinet or an oboe, if they're not vibrating, there's no sound. They are a reactive piece of equipment. If you don't do something to them, they won't respond. And what do singers do to set them in motion, set them vibrating? We pass air over them. Now, there's a lot of very complicated technical stuff that goes on in there, mechanical things that move around because of you're applying air to it. But you can't make them do that if you don't apply air. There's no link between a thought process and making this move. You can only make it move by applying air to it. So if you don't apply the air, it won't behave. And as a corollary to that, if you apply inefficient air, it will behave inefficiently. if you apply efficient air, it will behave efficiently. So you've got choices. No behaviour, bad behaviour, or good behaviour. No behaviour means no air. Bad behaviour means air but not well supplied. Good behaviour means air well supplied. If you can supply efficient air to the mechanism, it will behave itself all of the time, unless you're sick. If you're sick, all bets are off because suddenly out of nowhere, it's not behaving for external reasons you can't fix. So if you work on how to supply the air supply to that little set of, that little tiny set of that little fold, if you're going to work out how best for you, and every body, physically body, is different. If you can work out how best for you to apply really well supplied, efficient air to that mechanism, it will always do what you want. Always. Well, one of the things in master classes when I'm working with younger singers who are at the beginning of their career or finishing their schooling, is you say to them, okay, the vocal fold is one piece of tissue, and at one end it's open, and at the other end it's around a little post, tiny little post. And as you sing higher, the little ring of cartilage and bone that it's sitting on tilts backwards and forwards, and that's what stretches that piece of tissue between the two open ends and the little post that it goes around. And I say to young singers, okay, make that whole mechanism tilt, make it tilt forward. And they look at you like, well, how? Exactly. You cannot make that tilt unless you apply air from this way, or food or drink, or air that way. You have to do something to it to make it happen. And so, and the minute you say to them, okay, now inhale and start singing, and as you sing higher, that little bit of tissue, the vocal fold, will stretch, and it only stretches because it's at a post here and open here, and that does that. That's all it does, is it just tilts, and that makes that piece of tissue longer. You cannot make that happen unless you do something to it. And the minute you understand that something is airflow that way to produce tone, and airflow that way to refill your lungs, everything else comes naturally after that.
If we would start with inhalation, do you pay special attention to inhalation? Do you try to open your chest?
I probably did for a long time. I don't now, because I think muscle memory means that it does it by itself.
But you did work on trying to expand.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Chest.
You've got. I've always felt for me like it's some sort of like an inner tube. You know, the kids floating in the pool. Like, you know, those sorts of things. It goes all the way around. But the one thing that I think over time that I've sort of has occurred to me in performance and in the practical application of singing in front of people is that you can trick yourself into certain things, which is a really handy thing to be able to do. If you have a really long phrase, and in studio when you're working on the phrase, you never quite get to the end of the phrase the way you'd like to, or you're sort of running out to the point where you can't really finesse the phrase at the end the way you'd really love to do. I'm convinced that this works. I don't have any scientific evidence for it at all, apart from the fact that I know that it works when I do it, and I know that it works when I show other people how to. Is if you've got a long phrase, then breathe in really slowly and start early.
Start early to breathe? Or
breathe early.
Yeah.
Breathe a lot earlier than you think. Because if you inhale and fill that whole mechanism very, very, very slowly, when you let it out, your body will let it out slowly as well. If you take a fast breath and then try to make a long phrase, your body will get rid of the air faster. And I don't know why that's true. I have no idea why that works. But for me, if there's a particularly long phrase, I will start early and breathe in. And then onset the phrase. And the phrase goes, and I always get into the phrase and go, oh, I actually literally had air left over.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's just a mental trick into tricking your body into releasing the air as slowly as you, it puts it out as slowly as you put it in. And that's just a mental trick.
Yeah.
But it's a mental trick that actually has served me quite well over a long period of time. So I don't know whether it was a trick the first time and now it's just physically true because I've done it so often, or whether it's still a mental trick. But it was a mental trick when I first did it.
But then what happens once you've inhaled and you start to sing? How do you think about support?
I don't know that I think about it anymore.
No.
I used to. I think the thing about support is that you know that the whole system is going to collapse on you. It has to. Because if it doesn't collapse, you haven't exhaled yet. So as you fill these pliable bags, lungs, with air, and and everything that cage, that rib cage of bone and cartilage that surround these bags expands to accommodate the fact that the bags are now inflated. Balloons are inflated. As you let the air out of the balloons, the cage is going to get smaller again. So the system is going to collapse. It's designed to collapse. Our job is to control how fast it collapses. That's it. Our job is to control, okay, it's going to collapse, there's no way around it, because we're going to empty those bags and the vacuum will mean that cage that expanded will contract again. Our job is to use the muscles that we've trained over time, is to control the contraction. That's it. For me, support is all about making sure that when you've got the expansion through the rib cage and around here and through into the diaphragm, all that sort of thing, is that you control how it contracts. And the secret is that at its maximum contraction is exactly when you want to breathe in again. That's a timing thing. It's like, okay, expand, sing, 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 sing. Maximum contraction. Good, I need to breathe. And then you fill it up again and you just keep controlling it.
But when the air is going out, do you try to keep the rib cage still open?
No, well you do, but you're not trying to keep it open, you're trying to slow down how it closes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, you're just trying to slow down the process,
Yes.
or at least control the process, because it's gonna close. There's
Right.
nothing you can do about that. And let it close, but make sure that you're in control of how it closes, not it. There's another way to think of it, like the back in the day, a spring on a car. Those sorts of springs, they do nothing. You put them on a table, and it just sits there and does absolutely nothing until you press on it. You put that spring and press on it, and then suddenly it fights back. All right? So think of the system as a spring. So when you inhale, you compress that spring. Now the spring has gone from all potential energy, doing nothing, to now kinetic. Now the energy wants to go somewhere. Your job is to control how that spring comes back to rest, and then the minute you get into the phrase, compress the spring again and control how it comes back, and press it and control it and press it and control it for 5 hours. Simple.
That's a great metaphor.
Yeah, and I can't remember, I wish I could claim it was mine. It's not. Somebody explained it to me, and I wish, for their due credit, I could remember who it was. But it was all about, you put a spring on a table and it does absolutely nothing until you act on it.
Yeah.
Now, the springs there are springs that are at rest when they're contracted, and you pull them apart and they snap back together, and there are strings that are at rest when they're expanded, and you contract them and they want to expand again. That's what this is. This system is a spring that's expanded, and you want to compress it and then control how that goes from contracted to expanded again. And then and that's the exhale, that's the sing part, that's the energy, that's what provides the air with energy. And then at the end of that phrase, the system's got no energy in it, so you compress the spring again, and suddenly you've got all of the energy in the system, and then at the end of the phrase, the energy's gone, you just re-energize by pressing the spring again. And you just do that over and over and over again until you don't have to think about it. I get to
And
that
so,
point now.
what about if we talk a bit about the throat, the soft palate, the tongue, the jaw, such things?
I used to think about that,
Yes.
and the more I thought about it, the more hung up I got about what it looked like and what I was supposed to be doing and where my tongue was or wasn't, where my jaw was or wasn't, where the pharyngeal wall was or wasn't. And I realised the more I thought about it, the more I started thinking about stuff I can't control. Because again, a lot of that stuff is reactive. If you provide really efficient air, they'll just get out of the way. They'll do it themselves. I mean, one of my absolute heroes, Plácido Domingo, when you see close-ups of him singing, from a purely technical singing teacher point of view, he's like, what is he doing with his tongue? I don't care. because it's absolutely amazing the way he sounds and the way he sings. I don't care what he's doing with his tongue.
Because, what is it
obviously
doing? Is it because it's an interesting
it
thing?
stands up.
So it goes up, yeah. Because a lot of singing teachers will tell you to keep
Keep
your
it
tongue
flat.
down.
Pavarotti, always flat as you like. Domingo,
Right.
or it always curls up a little bit. And you look at it and go, I don't care what he's doing with it, you know? Because let's face it, it's Plácido. It totally works. Good for you. And that's fine, you know?
Yeah.
I really don't think about it. I really don't.
No.
You know,
But you've gone through that process.
Yeah, I
though.
did it when I was starting out, because you get a lot of that information. And so you're constantly thinking, and then of course you realise that's getting in the way of providing airflow. I think if you provide really, really, really solid, consistent, efficient air, all of that stuff will just sort itself out to a very large extent. Not entirely, but to a very large extent. It will. It'll do it because it doesn't need to be involved. If you concentrate on getting these big muscles that don't get tired, because if they did get tired, we'd stop breathing. You know, there are lots of muscles that get tired. You know, if you sit there and do this for 5 minutes, you know, this stuff here gets properly tired. And so, but these ones, we breathe 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on average, about 75 to 80 years. And you never think, oh, my breathing is tired. You never think that.
Do you not get tired in your intercostal muscles?
No, not
singing?
really.
No?
I'm aware that I've worked them, but they're never tired to the point where they stop.
No.
You know, whereas if you do this for 5 minutes, you will get to the point where you literally have to stop doing it. So these are muscles, they're slow twitch, which means that they do the same thing over and over again for their entire lives and never really think about being tired. So let those muscles do all the hard work.
Yeah.
These little tiny ones in here that make tiny, tiny little adjustments, they get tired very quickly because they're tiny little fast twitch muscles. So they get tired quick. So take all the effort away from there, put all the effort on the muscles that are used to it, and all these little muscles make their tiny little adjustments only when necessary, so they don't get tired.
Makes a lot of sense.
Right? I mean, this is the engine. This is the engine room.
Yeah.
This is the engine room. So rely on the engine room to just churn out the air, minute after minute, phrase after phrase, hour after hour, for your entire career. And then the more you can rely on that and make the engine room do the work, these little tiny muscles do exactly what they're supposed to do without having to do anything they're not supposed to do, which means they don't get tired.
What about top notes?
Yes.
Highest notes?
Yes.
You know, those very exciting top notes. The audience is like, is he going to break or is he not going to break? Right? Especially that
there's an expectation of failure.
I don't know if it has anything to do with the circus, you know. Are they going to fall?
Maybe it is.
It might be, you know, because there's a certain danger, isn't there, when a tenor is going up to his top range.
Yeah.
And sometimes the voice cracks.
Yeah.
You know, and it's probably
it's happened to me.
Yeah.
Usually when I'm sick, and when I should have said I can't sing today, and I didn't say that and then sang. And you learn. I think there are two things, particularly when you're starting out, is that the top notes, particularly the more dramatic the voice is, the more finessing you'll have to do to a certain extent. But I think the best thing to do is to sing those things that you know, where even if there is a top note coming, you have a really good plan for approaching it. You know, you don't get there and think, now what do I do? Because that's the worst thing to have to happen. You're like, gosh, I've got this note coming up, I'm not quite sure how I make that work. Don't sing anything until you're sure of how that works. That's the first thing. And I think the second thing is, over time, you work out how those, and everybody, I mean, singers talk about the Passaggio, that little introductory passage, hence the word Passaggio, between the voice being largely produced in what we would call chest voice and largely produced being on what we call the head voice. There's that little gap where it transitions between the two. And every singer has their Passaggio in a slightly different spot. And I've always liked to think of it kind of like an hourglass, is that in that little Passaggio, everything just sort of, the way through narrows down. And then once you're at the other side, it opens back up again. And it's something that's echoed in fluid fluid mechanics and in electricity. Volts is the number of volts in a given storage capacity. Amps measures how fast they're travelling. So low voltage but high amps is just as dangerous as lots of volts with no amps. Fluid mechanics is the same. You have a huge river, huge, massively wide river, and you can stand up to your knees in the river and it doesn't bowl you over. You take that same river and put it through a very narrow causeway, suddenly you got no resistance against that. But there's no more water. The water's exactly the same, it's just moving through a very, very small channel.
So that'd be
There's
your
more energy.
air then?
But the air in this case is the air moving through a very broad channel, and then as it gets to Passaggio, that little channel narrows, so the speed at which the air moves, the intensity with which the air moves, suddenly is much, 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 much faster and much more intense. And I think that's the secret to making sure that when you get out, when the river broadens at the other side, that you've got everything where it needs to be to approach whatever it is the top is. I think if you try to take that intensity through a very, very big space, you're never going to have the intensity for it. You just won't have the air for it. So you've got to be able to think that everything gets more. It's not constricted. It's just more intense. Everything moves faster for a little bit. So when it comes out the other side, the whole system has gone from being dragged down here to being elevated. There's a set of muscles, depressors, and a set of elevator muscles, and they work in tandem. At the bottom of your voice, these ones are active, and they're keeping the larynx quite low so that the chords are as thick, so they have the lowest resonances. And as you go through the voice, ideally, the depressor muscles start to give way and the elevators take over and they pull the larynx up, and as the larynx comes up, it tilts forward and the chords get longer and the edge gets thinner, which means the tones get higher. So it's letting that system do its thing without you getting in the way of it. These are these small muscles I was talking about a minute ago. These are the ones that do this, but if you make them, if you give the air to it so it just does it by itself, they don't get tired. If you're trying to hold these or make these work early, then they'll get tired, and then suddenly you won't have the flexibility that you need.
Yeah.
And I think the other really important thing, particularly for, at least for tenors, boys, I think male voices in general, is the top of their voice should sound to the person who's singing it like it's not really all that present. If it sounds like it's really big in your head, we probably can't hear it. It's about singing to an auditorium full of people. If it's big in your head, it's useless.
Right.
Because the audience are paying to hear it, not you. So I think you need to think of these what I would think of the extreme top, B natural C sharps, if you have those sorts of things, is that it needs to feel to you like it's quite a small and yet focused sound, not a big. You don't want it to sound like Corelli in your head. You want to sound like Corelli outside your head.
No.
If you're singing along and it sounds like Corelli in your head, you're probably doing it wrong. Because you want to feel like it's a small yet very fast moving and very intense sound, rather than this big, massive Rhine river sort of thing. You want it to feel like it's. You should be disappointed with what it sounds like in your head.
And do you feel pressure in certain places, or?
Well, if I do, I'm not aware of it. I may do, but
No.
I don't know whether I do or not.
And I'm wondering about this, because the top voice of the tenor voice, and then falsetto or head voice, because I've heard you sing in Music by Britain, a note that you started off very, very gently.
Oh, that's Now the Great Baron Pleiades, yeah.
Yes, and then bit by bit you crescendo into a full chest voice.
Yes.
And I was thinking when I was listening to this, how does he do it? How can he start it like this, and how can it grow so well?
There's a trick to that.
Yeah.
Is that the quietest bit isn't actually falsetto.
Okay.
It's not quite.
So what would you call it?
They call it var mixed. It's right on that edge of between, and it would be very easy to go from what it is to falsetto the step to falsetto would be very, very small step. But the way to do it is to just find, and every singer will be different, in somewhere in a room where it doesn't matter if it falls off. Because if you go from what that is to falsetto, there will be a slight, there'll be a click. Because the vocal fold will touch. The minute it touches, of course, the sound stops. So there will be a little dip in it. So you get into a room where it doesn't matter when you do that, and find where that edge is. Just find it.
Yeah.
For you, and everyone will be different. You know, for me, that's changed over time as well. It's different now than it was when I did my first grinds 16 years ago. It's different now than it was 16 years ago. And I think only because I've been doing it for so long, it's actually easier to do it more quietly now than it was 16 years ago. So I think it's just sort of got the muscle memory and it's gotten used to the fact that it's going to do that, so it does it by itself to a certain extent.
And are you already supporting from the, I mean, would you say you're supporting more when you are singing crescendo or?
The support, the intensity of the air is at its most intense the quieter you are. Because if you don't keep the air intense, it will fall off, and you've got to keep that vocal fold, you've got to keep them apart. So you've got to keep air over the top of it. Now, the louder you sing, the intensity will come anyway. So that thing about particularly that part and those things, and Grimes has got a few examples of that, is that you've got to be able to find that very fine edge where it's not falsetto, but it could be. And then find out wherever that edge is for you, step right up to that edge, and make sure that you support that so it doesn't fall into falsetto. Unless you wanted to. If you wanted to fall, that's by all means do that. That's fine. It's not a philosophical problem with falsetto. It's just that with falsetto, you can't go from falsetto to full voice without a gear change. And I think another great barrier in palate is you have to be able to do it without a gear change. So work out everybody's version of what pianissimo at the beginning of that phrase will be different, depending on what their fortissimo is, and what can I do without a gear change in between. And then everyone's different.
When you practice, do you also practice falsetto or head voice, or mostly?
I have a little warm-up routine that has falsetto in it, but only as an extension of just getting the chords to stretch, and I only do it twice. It's one of those things. I don't work on it particularly, but I do know that if my falsetto in these particular exercises goes to a certain point, I know that everything's in good shape. If it doesn't go to a certain point, then I know I have to warm up a little bit more and then try it again. Just as it's a little test. I check in with it to see what it's feeling like. But the falsetto is not something. I mean, it's there or it's not. You know, and everyone can do it because I mean, you're just blowing a hole instead of having the whole chord vibrate. You're just blowing a little hole in it, and only that little hole is vibrating, little gap. And everyone can do that. But I don't. In my repertoire, there's not a lot of call for it.
No.
But there is a lot of call, I think, particularly in Wagner, to be able to find that fine edge. You know, that in Act 2. You have to be able to crescendo out of that if you want, but you can't have it falsetto because you can't crescendo out of it. So you have to find that fine edge. And every performance, the fine edge is in a different spot. You know, you have to know when you're going into that phrase, where's it going to be today? And you start, you go, oh, there it is. Okay, that's fine. And you know,
how do you warm up before a show?
Depends on what I'm singing. If I'm singing Wagner, very little, particularly Parsifal or Siegmund or Tristan particularly. I don't warm up much, just enough.
Because you don't want to tire yourself out?
Yeah, that, and because they're not very high, at least they don't start very high. They get higher as the opera goes on. So you're doing a lot of warming up on the stage. But I always do enough that everything is exactly where I feel it should be. And then once I get to that, I stop. And that's the tough part, is stopping. When you know it's ready, stop it. You're not going to get anything extra out of it. There is a law of diminishing returns at some point. So, but for Strauss, I warm up a lot. Because because you've got to go out there and the very first thing you're seeing is just like these screaming high notes with this terrible tessitura. So you have to know that that's warm and ready to go.
Yeah.
So for Strauss, I warm up a lot more than I would for any of the Wagner stuff I see.
And would you do breathing exercises as well? Do you do breathing exercises in general?
I do to go to sleep, interestingly enough. That
to calm down.
That helps me sleep. But in terms of the singing stuff, the breathing exercises are built in.
Yeah.
You know, I've had the same very boring, and I'm sure very, very monotonous to listen to if you're in the dressing room next door, warm up for as long as I can remember, and it hasn't changed, and I don't change it because it works. And it provides both. It provides an incremental step of warming up the voice in the middle, and then from the bottom to the top and through the whole range. And part of that process is just getting the breathing working at the same time.
So do you start in the middle and then go up and then down,
I
or
start
do you
at the bottom.
start
I start at the moderate bottom.
What notes?
Well, I start at C below middle.
Yeah.
And I work up 6 notes on 3 vowels up to G sharp, and then I start and I work on an octave plus 1 to G sharp on all 3 vowels, and then I work up then an octave plus 5 from C to A flat, G sharp, and then once I've got all of those vowels, the 3 vowels are and I out of the way on those, then I do all of that again up to the A natural, and once I've got A natural, I walk away.
Okay, so
once I feel like the A natural is all 3 vowels is there all of the time, I just leave it because I know everything above that will be when I need it. And particularly in Wagner, because you don't start out high. You start out low, and over the course of the opera, that's where you get to the bits that are most demanding. So I like to leave that for the end of the show, because you're going to need it at the end of the show. So
if you could give some advice to young singers, you know, who are studying now
in 2020, go and be lawyers. Go and do anything but singing. I'm kidding. No. I think the really important thing, I was talking to Kirsten Sigmund the other day. So one of the really important things is to, in between lessons, work on what you discovered and what you dealt with in your lesson. Because if you don't do the work in between the lessons, a week apart, say, then when you come back, the person who was teaching, your teacher, has got nothing extra to listen to. So work. And if something doesn't work, if you've got a teacher that's, as much as you respect them and as much of good information they're giving you, if they give you a piece of information that you try to make work and it doesn't work, then discard it. Just, you know, I mean, I've said this in master classes a lot, and it's an incredibly weird situation in master classes because you've got these singers who don't know me, I don't know their voices at all. And the most exciting thing for me in a master class is watching their singing colleagues who are sitting there, watching them react to something that's changed. Because I don't know. I'm hearing them for the first time, but their colleagues are hearing them all of the time, so they hear something immediately and they see a change, and you can hear them go, and you see it on their faces, and you stop them immediately and say, did you see your colleagues' faces? And they go, yes, that's right. Right, we'll do that again, because they obviously know the difference. Because I don't know the difference, I can't possibly know the difference. So if there's something that's working, keep it. If it doesn't work, and I don't care if it's from me or whoever it is, doesn't matter how famous or well respected they are, if they come in and you're doing a masterclass and they get you to something and it doesn't work, then stop doing it. You know, it's no shame in that. I mean, the whole idea of us teaching singing and us learning singing is to get out there and put it into practice.
Yes.
If you're being taught something that's not helping you put it in practice, don't do that bit. I don't care who tells you that. I mean, I don't care where that information comes from. If it doesn't work, don't do it. If it does work, great. And if you have to take information from here and here and here over time, that's fine. I mean, that's how because you learn for yourself what your voice can and can't do, and you learn what it feels like, and you learn how to reproduce things that work well. Over time, you know your body better than anyone else. You know, there will be always a set of ears that can say, and you'll make a little adjustment, and you go, oh, that's what I was looking for. But if something's being told to you over and over again, and it's just not working, try something else. You know, there's no shame in that at all. I mean, all of us out there, and particularly in this repertoire, so many different voice types singing the same thing. I mean, you know, Klaus Florian Vogt, Andy Schager, Jonas, myself, Simon and Neil, we all have very, very different voices. And we're all singing pretty much the same repertoire. And we're all doing it very, very differently, and we're all still doing it. So there's no one way.
No.
There's no one way to make that work. What works for you may not work for someone else, may not work for this person. And I think that's really important to hold on to a sense of self for that. That's really important.
Trust
to do
yourself.
That. Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to do that. That's unbelievable. Is really trust yourself. And if something really isn't working, you'll know. And that's a bit of information you can let go.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, my
for this
pleasure. Thank you for having
interview. Yeah, no, and I'm looking so much forward to listening to you.
I'm looking forward to it.
Again, live, but
It's
now
gonna be
in
fun.
this hall
I know. It's
here
so
in
exciting.
Hafnaborg.
So exciting.
So best of luck with everything,
Takk
and
fyrir.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Takk kærlega fyrir.
Takk fyrir okkar.